The wood arrives first. Incense cedar, grown in Pacific forests for 40 years before it's ever cut. Cedar isn't picked for its scent alone, though that warm smell will follow the pencil its whole life, faint but familiar every sharpening. It's picked because it slices like butter under a sharpener, where cheaper woods can splinter more easily and leave a rougher shaving. The dry slats knock into alignment before a groover cuts 8 narrow channels into each board, ready to cradle a graphite core. Next time your pencil sharpens into one unbroken ribbon instead of crumbling, that's the cedar doing its job. Here's something most people never think to ask. What makes one pencil write dark and soft, while another scratches thin and hard? The answer sits in a mixing vat, before any wood is involved. Graphite powder and clay are blended into a wet paste. More clay for a harder line, more graphite for a softer one. No two factories using the same ratio. The paste is forced through a die, into thin spaghetti-like rods, then fired in a kiln until firm enough to handle, but still soft enough to leave a mark. Even after firing, the rods get one more treatment, a soak in wax, so the core glides instead of dragging on paper. Now, the wood and the core finally meet, and this is where a pencil actually becomes a pencil. Fired, wax-treated rods drop into the 8 grooved channels of one cedar board, and a second grooved board presses down on top. A wood and graphite sandwich clamped under several tons of pressure. Sealed into one long, continuous strip with barely a visible seam. Here's the part almost nobody pictures correctly. That strip isn't cut into one pencil at a time. A single blade slices straight through it, and 8 complete pencils drop out in the same pass, born from one board in under 2 seconds. This factory turns out roughly 175,000 pencils a day from a line just like this one, enough for every student in a mid-sized city to start the school year with a fresh one in hand. A rotating cutter shapes each pencil into its familiar hexagon next, not for looks, but so it never rolls off a desk edge onto the floor. 8 pencils, one clean row, still warm from the press. The raw hexagon still looks nothing like the pencil in your hand. That comes next, in the paint booth, where each one gets dipped again and again, sometimes 7 or 8 times, until the surface turns glassy smooth and every brushstroke disappears completely. At the tip, a small metal band called a ferrule gets crimped on, gripping tight enough to survive years of sharpeners without ever loosening. An operator checks the crimp line by eye and touch, since even a small gap can let the eraser twist loose later, usually at the worst possible moment. A stamping wheel presses the grade onto the shaft. B grades write softer and darker. H grades stay lighter and hold a sharper point. One glance most people ignore, though it's really a shopping shortcut. From here, pencils get packed in groups of 12 or 24, the same count you've picked off a store shelf every August, usually without a second thought. Cases get sealed, stacked, and shipped toward the exact aisle where your hand will eventually find them. But before any of those cases leave the building, one more round of scrutiny happens behind the scenes, and it's stricter than most people would guess. Inspectors pull sample pencils from each finished batch before the sealed cases are released. Each one gets checked for a straight, uncurved body, a core sitting dead center rather than off to one side, and a tip that resists snapping under light pressure. If the core sits off center, the pencil breaks unevenly the first time it sharpens, a flaw no sharpener can fix, so that batch never leaves the building. But every pencil leaves a mark, and its partner is built to remove one. That rubbing action gave rubber its name in 1770, though the material starts out far too sticky to erase anything. That familiar block in a pencil case may not contain natural rubber at all. Many modern erasers use a soft plastic compound designed to wear away as it works. Before rubber erasers existed, people lifted pencil marks with pieces of bread. On this line, The process begins with a pale resin that looks nothing like the firm block it will become. The main binder, the plastic base that holds the block together, arrives as a fine white PVC resin. On this line, it is chosen because it stays flexible and resists the hardening that can affect natural rubber with age. A thick plasticizer pours in next, coating the powder and softening it so the finished block bends slightly instead of scratching the page. Mineral filler follows, giving the mixture body and controlling how quickly the surface wears. Color is added here too, not painted on later. A good eraser should work with light pressure, leave little gray smear, and shed crumbs that brush away cleanly. The surprising part is how little the recipe has to change before the eraser behaves completely differently. The dry ingredients tumble together first, followed by the liquid plasticizer. Heat and mixing turn the blend into a dense, sticky mass. Warm enough to flow, but still far thicker than ordinary melted plastic. More softener can make the finished block smear or wear too quickly. Too little can leave it stiff and harsh against paper. The factory adjusts that balance for each style of eraser, because the difference between a clean lift and a gray streak begins inside this mixer. Now, the shapeless compound becomes one continuous eraser. A screw inside the extruder kneads the warm mass and forces it through a rectangular die, pushing out a smooth strip with the same profile from end to end. Warm, even, and strangely soft. Cooling equipment firms the strip so it can hold its shape instead of sagging under its own weight. The erasing trick happens at the surface. As the block moves across paper, its polymer grips loose graphite more strongly than the paper fibers do. The mark transfers into the soft residue, and the dark crumbs carry it away. The eraser slowly gives up part of itself to remove the line. That familiar pile of gray crumbs is the missing pencil mark, trapped in worn-away polymer. Once the strip is cool, a cutter divides it into individual blocks. One endless length becomes a steady row of identical blanks, each holding the same carefully balanced softness from end to end on the line. The first surprise is that the color is not a coating. Every fresh cut reveals the same shade all the way through because the pigment was mixed in before extrusion. The blocks still need edges that feel right in the hand, so a trimming blade keeps some corners crisp for detailed work while softening others. If the blade drags, it leaves a rough lip along the vinyl, and the setup has to be corrected. A stamping die presses the name or grade into the surface without adding a paper label. The impression must remain readable as the eraser wears, yet stay shallow enough not to distort the block. It also has to land in the same place on every piece. Flat faces, clean corners, one sharp stamp. The warm strip now looks like the eraser people recognize. Paper sleeves or protective film before they enter cartons. The wrapper is not only decoration, it keeps dirt and skin oils off the working surface and gives the fingers a dry place to grip while the block gets smaller. Packed by the dozen or in larger classroom boxes, the erasers move toward the same school supply aisle as the pencils they are built to correct. Before release, samples from each batch face a hardness check and an erase test. If the compound is too firm, it can turn the graphite into a gray smear or roughen the paper. That batch is held back. Another sample crosses a standard pencil line, so inspectors can compare the remaining mark, loose residue, and paper damage against the approved result. Clean paper, soft crumbs, no torn fibers. But removing a line is only half the job. The next tool must lay one down through a tiny metal ball, loose enough to spin, yet tight enough to keep the ink from leaking. A long-lasting ballpoint can draw one unbroken line up to 3 kilometers before it runs dry, about 27 lengths of an American football field. Early fountain pens were nothing like that. They leaked, smudged, and needed refilling every few pages. At this factory, it turns out, the fix for all of that starts from something almost too small for the eye to catch. The metal here doesn't become the reservoir, it becomes the tip. Small brass blanks arrive first, chosen because brass cuts cleanly into the tiny channels that guide ink toward the page. The writing ball is tungsten carbide, picked because its hard surface holds its shape through years of use instead of wearing thin. Rough balls rattle into a feeder before precision grinding gives each one a smooth, even roundness. The ink waits in a slim plastic tube, clear enough to show how much is left. A pen that glides under light pressure without skipping shows off a good match between ball, seat, and ink. Here's a question worth sitting with. Why does ink this thick stay put inside the pen, yet spread into a clean, even line the moment the ball starts turning? Colorant, resin, solvent, and a touch of lubricant blend together in heated tanks until the mixture turns dense and glossy. Noticeably thicker than the ink inside a fountain pen. That thickness is exactly what keeps it from flooding the tip. As the ball rotates, it carries only the thinnest film onto the page, and once that film lands, part of the solvent sinks into the paper fibers, leaving the color behind clean and dry within seconds. The hardest part of this pen isn't filling the tube, it's cutting a seat that can hold a ball roughly a millimeter wide without ever letting it jam. High-speed tooling drills the ink channel straight into each brass blank, shapes the cone around it, then carves the curved seat at the very tip. That fit is controlled at the micron level, far too fine to judge with the naked eye. The polished ball drops into that seat, and a forming die folds a thin lip of brass gently around it, holding the ball in place while leaving it completely free to spin. Loose enough to roll. As the pen moves, one side of the ball picks up ink from the reservoir, while the exposed side lays that narrow film onto the page, and every single ball gets checked for roundness before it ever reaches this step, because the smallest flaw here turns a smooth line into a skip or a blot. The finished tip joins the ink-filled tube, and the rear end seals shut, so nothing leaks before the pen ever reaches a hand. Now the refill needs a body worth holding, and that body is a simple capped stick pen. Plastic pellets melt down inside an injection molder and fill the barrel, the rear plug, and the cap in a matter of seconds, then cool and release onto the line. One tiny feature here carries far more responsibility than its size suggests. The small opening running through the very tip of the cap is a safety vent, there so air can still pass through if the cap is ever swallowed. The cap snaps down over the finished pen, but that satisfying click only confirms the fit. It says nothing about whether the vent actually breathes. Mold technicians keep an eye out for stray plastic flash around that opening, since even a sliver can quietly choke off the airflow it's there to provide. Finished pens settle into trays with caps and rear plugs matched to their ink color. The clear barrel lets a buyer see exactly how much ink remains at a glance, while the capped point stays shielded from dust in a bag or a drawer. Pens are counted into packs, boxed and labeled, the familiar cartons that disappear into desk drawers and office cabinets, before the cases move on for one final round of checks. Inspectors pull samples from each lot and run them on machines that keep the tip moving steadily across paper. If the ball sits too tight, the line skips. If the fit runs too loose, ink gathers into a small blot. Either flaw gets caught right here. A separate sample faces an airflow test on the cap vent, since an opening that looks clear can still let through too little air. Only lots that pass every check ship. A ballpoint leaves its mark by rolling a thin film of ink onto the page. The next pen goes further. Its ink seems to glow, borrowing light the eye can't see and sending part of it back as color. Two teenage brothers created this glow completely by accident while chasing a magic show trick back in the 1930s. A decade later, that same glowing paint was guiding pilots onto aircraft carriers, long before anyone thought to dab it onto a felt tip. At this factory, that same daylight glow starts life as a plain, colorless liquid. The base arrives first, a clear, water-based liquid chosen because it dries quickly and carries only a faint smell, nothing like the sharper solvent found in older marker formulas. Next comes the real star, a fluorescent dye, so concentrated that a few drops can tint an entire mixing tank. A length of dense, absorbent fiber follows, destined to become the ink reservoir hidden inside every barrel. For school or office use, a good highlighter usually lists a water-based, low-odor ink with a recognized non-toxic certification right on the label. Here's a question worth sitting with. How can a plain yellow streak look brighter than the white page sitting right underneath it? The dye blends into that clear base until the liquid turns thick and glassy, and only then does its real trick show itself. It absorbs some of the shorter, invisible light hiding in ordinary daylight, then releases part of that energy back out as visible color, adding itself to the light already bouncing off the page. That's not the ink glowing in the dark. It only works because there's light around to feed on in the first place. The reservoir starts as a thick rope of packed synthetic fiber, cut to length and slid into a hollow sleeve built to live inside the barrel. A metering pump saturates that fiber core with a measured dose of dye-tinted liquid, soaking every strand until the whole reservoir turns one even color, holding ink like a sponge instead of sloshing loose. Dense, damp, and faintly golden. Meanwhile, a separate blade grinds the tip of a fiber bundle at an angle, shaping the familiar chisel point that gives two widths in one nib, a broad edge for sweeping across a sentence, a narrow corner for underlining a single word. That nib presses directly against the saturated reservoir, and from there, physics takes over. Thousands of microscopic gaps between the packed fibers pull ink upward by capillary action, the same quiet pull that lets a paper towel drink up a spill, keeping the tip wet without a pump anywhere in the design. Get that fiber spacing even slightly wrong, and the balance breaks. Too open floods the nib, too tight fades the streak pale. The finished nib and reservoir assembly slides into the waiting barrel, ready for its cap. With the reservoir sealed inside, the barrel still needs its final pieces. An injection motor shapes the outer casing and rear plug in seconds, and that plug locks the reservoir in place so it can't shift during shipping. A snug-fitting cap then seals over the nib, and that seal matters more than it looks. Every time the cap comes off, the water-based ink loses moisture into the air, so a precise, snug fit keeps a highlighter usable weeks after its first use. A quality technician checks that seal by hand on random samples, since a machine reading a cap is closed can still miss a barrel a fraction of a millimeter out of round. One choice almost nobody questions. The ink dries as a transparent wash rather than an opaque coat, so printed words underneath stay perfectly legible through the color. From here, finished highlighters settle into trays, sorted by color before boxing. A stray shade in the wrong set gets caught immediately. The cap stays snapped on throughout packing. Since every extra minute the nib sits exposed, the water-based ink keeps losing moisture into the air. Packed into the familiar multicolor sets living in every backpack and desk drawer, cases move on for one last round of checks. Inspectors pull samples from every lot and test them on paper, checking line width, ink flow, and how closely the color matches an approved reference chip under office light. Too much ink saturating the reservoir bleeds the streak through thin paper. Too little fades the line to a whisper before a sentence ends. Either flaw gets caught here. A separate check uncaps a sample, waits, then recaps it, confirming the tip still writes cleanly after sitting exposed. Only lots holding a clean, true line ship. Next time a yellow streak looks brighter than the page underneath it, remember, the dye isn't creating light out of nothing. It's simply turning part of the light you can't see into color you can.